The call came on a Tuesday, in the middle of a shift that already felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Rae Calloway wiped flour from her hands and pressed the phone to her ear, expecting a wrong number, a scam, anything but the voice that actually spoke. "Miss Calloway, this is Bill Hendricks, attorney for the Calloway estate. I'm sorry for your loss." Loss? She almost laughed. You couldn't lose what had already been taken from you years ago. Her family had erased her long before the accident that killed them, the slow kind of erasure. The kind built from unanswered calls and empty chairs at holidays, until one day she simply stopped being invited to be forgotten. 10 years of silence, and now silence had a lawyer attached to it. She sat through the reading of the will in an office that smelled like old paper and colder ambition. Her cousins received the house on Magnolia Street, the investment accounts, the family's furniture business with its glass storefront downtown. Numbers were read aloud like scripture, 6 figures, 7 figures, and every time Rae's name was absent, until the very end. To Rae Calloway, Hendricks read, not quite meeting her eyes. The property, known as Calloway Orchard, 60 acres, together with all associated debts and liens. Debts, liens. Even in death, they'd found one more way to hand her nothing wrapped in the shape of something. Her cousin Meredith didn't bother hiding her smile. "Guess they wanted you to have something." Rae said nothing. She thought of the bank notice that would already be waiting in that mailbox, of trees nobody had pruned in years, of a name, Calloway, that had never once felt like it belonged to her. She was 34 years old, and she had just inherited her family's garbage. She had no idea yet that it was about to change everything. The road to the orchard hadn't changed, even if everything else had. Gravel popped under her tires the same way it had when she was 8 years old, riding in the bed of her grandfather's truck with peach juice sticky on her chin. Back then, this place had smelled like sunlight and sugar. Now, as she pulled through the sagging gate, it smelled like rust and rain that had nowhere to drain. Rae stepped out of the car slowly, the way you'd approach something sleeping that might wake up angry. 60 acres stretched in front of her, and every inch of it looked tired. Irrigation lines lay cracked and useless along the rows, split open like old scars. Weeds had crept up through the earth where neat grass paths used to run. The trees themselves stood crooked and overgrown, branches tangled together as if they'd been left to fight each other for light. And there, at the end of the drive, the farmhouse waited, paint peeling, porch sagging, curtains still hanging crooked in the windows, exactly as she remembered them. Frozen, like the whole property had been holding its breath since the last time she was welcome here. She walked closer, and the memories came whether she wanted them or not. Summers spent barefoot between these rows, her grandfather's laugh booming from the porch, her mother's hands, sticky with jam, teaching her how to pick a peach without bruising it. A family that had once felt like hers. She didn't know exactly when that had ended. There had been no single conversation, no dramatic goodbye, just a slow closing of doors, an absence that grew louder every year until she stopped knocking. Standing here now, surrounded by everything they'd left to rot, one question rose in her chest sharper than grief. Why did they cut me out? And why leave me this? The orchard didn't answer. It just watched her, the way it always had. She walked the rows the way you'd walk through a house after a funeral, careful, quiet, half expecting someone to tell her she wasn't allowed. That was when she noticed it. The ground beneath the trees was littered with fruit, not shriveled, not rotted the way neglected orchards should be, but full, heavy peaches, dozens of them, scattered across the dirt like they'd been dropped in a hurry. She stopped walking and looked up. These trees shouldn't have been fruiting at all. The irrigation was broken. The soil was cracked. By every rule she half remembered from childhood, trees this neglected should have been barren years ago, if they'd survived at all. And yet here they stood, heavy with color, dropping fruit faster than the ground could hide it. Rae crouched and picked one up. It was warm from the sun, impossibly perfect in her palm. No blemish, no rot. Just soft golden skin stretched tight. She turned it once, twice, then, without warning, it split. Not the way overripe fruit split, not a bruised, mushy give. This was a clean fracture, almost deliberate, as if the peach had been waiting for exactly this pressure to open. Juice ran warm over her fingers, and nestled where the pit should have been, something caught the light, metal. She went still. Her thumb brushed it, small, hard-edged, unmistakably man-made, buried inside fruit that had grown around it like the tree itself had been guarding a secret. Rae's pulse climbed into her throat. She looked down the long, crooked row at the dozens of other peaches scattered across the dirt, and a single thought settled cold and clear in her chest. How many more of these are hiding the same thing? Earl Whitfield had worked the Calloway land for 30 years before his knees gave out and the family let him go without so much as a handshake. He lived now in a small house at the edge of town, and when Rae knocked on his door holding the small metal object wrapped in a cloth, his face changed before she even opened her hand. "You found that in the orchard," he said. It wasn't a question. "In a peach," Rae said. It split open and this was inside. Earl didn't reach for it. He stared at it the way a man might stare at a snake curled on his porch, recognizing danger before understanding it. "Put that away," he said quietly. "And don't go telling folks where you found it." "Earl, what is this? What's going on with that orchard?" He was quiet for a long moment, glancing past her shoulder as if the road itself might be listening. Then he sighed, the kind of sigh that had been waiting years to come out. "Your family," he said, "the Calloways, they always kept 2 sets of books. One for the bank, one for themselves." He shook his head slowly. "Nobody ever asked what the second set was for. Wasn't smart to ask. Are you saying there's money out there? Hidden?" "I'm saying that land's been holding on to something a long time," Earl said. "And your grandfather made sure it stayed buried until the day it didn't need to be anymore." Rae's mind raced. "Until what day?" Earl looked at her then, really looked, the fear in his eyes shifting into something closer to pity. "The day the right Calloway finally came looking," he said. "Maybe that's you. Maybe it isn't, but if it is, girl, you'd best be careful who finds out first." The envelope was waiting in the farmhouse mailbox when Rae got back, official and unforgiving. The bank's letterhead stamped across the top like a verdict already decided. She read it twice before the words fully landed. Notice of default. 30 days to remedy outstanding balance or the property will proceed to foreclosure sale. 30 days. She sat down hard on the porch steps, letter shaking slightly in her hand. She thought of her checking account, thin as paper, barely enough to cover her rent back in the city, let alone a debt that had been quietly rotting for years before it ever became hers. There was no lump sum coming, no safety net, no family left to call, even if pride would have let her. For a moment, the old shame crept back in, the same feeling she'd carried for a decade, the sense of being the Calloway who never measured up, who was always one step behind everyone else's success. Except this time, failure wouldn't just sting. It would cost her the one thing that, against all logic, was starting to feel like it mattered. And still, something nagged beneath the panic. If the orchard was truly worthless, why the urgency? Bankrupt land didn't usually inspire fast timelines and firm letters. Banks were patient with lost causes. But this letter didn't read patient. It read pressured, like someone wanted the clock ticking loud and fast, before Rae had time to look too closely at what she'd actually inherited. She thought of the metal fragment sitting on the kitchen table, of Earl's warning, of ledgers her family had kept hidden for decades, 30 days to lose everything, or 30 days to find out exactly why someone wanted her to. Rae folded the letter, stood up, and went back inside to start digging. Meredith called 2 days later, her voice honeyed in a way it never used to be. "I've been thinking about you out there," she said, "all alone on that dying orchard. Honestly, Rae, it can't be good for you." "Let me take it off your hands." Rae nearly laughed. In 10 years, Meredith hadn't sent a birthday card, let alone called to check on her well-being. "Take it off my hands how?" "Cash offer. Generous one. More than fair, considering the state of it." The number Meredith named stopped Rae cold. It wasn't generous. It was absurd. Nearly triple what any real estate site would have valued 60 acres of bankrupt farmland, debts included. Nobody paid that much for a liability. Not unless the liability was hiding something they wanted badly enough to overpay for. "That's a strange amount for worthless land," Rae said carefully. A beat of silence, just half a second too long. "I just want to simplify things for you," Meredith said. "You clearly don't want the burden." "I didn't say that, Rae." The honey thinned, sharpened at the edges. "You should really think about this quickly. Offers like this don't sit around. And you're not the only one who might be interested. Not the only one." The words hung there long after Rae hung up the phone, cold water down her spine. Someone else was circling, maybe more than one someone, and the fact that her own cousin, who had never once wanted anything to do with Rae, was suddenly desperate to buy 60 acres of dying trees told her everything the number itself hadn't. They weren't trying to rescue her from a burden. They were trying to beat her to whatever the orchard was still hiding. Rae looked out the kitchen window at the crooked rows stretching into the dark, and for the first time felt the ground beneath her shift from grief into something closer to war. The attic hadn't been touched in years, judging by the dust that rose in slow clouds when Rae pushed open the hatch. She climbed up with a flashlight clenched between her teeth, half expecting cobwebs and nothing else. Instead, tucked behind a stack of old crates, she found a wooden box with her grandfather's initials burned into the lid. Inside was a ledger, its leather cover cracked with age, and a bundle of letters tied together with twine gone brittle and grey. She sat cross-legged on the attic floor and opened the ledger first. The numbers meant little to her at a glance, columns of figures, dates stretching back decades. But one thing was clear, even to an untrained eye. There were 2 sets of entries for nearly every season. One column matched what she vaguely remembered of the family's public losses. The other told a different story entirely, numbers far healthier than any bankrupt orchard should have produced. Earl's warning came back to her. 2 sets of books. The letters told the rest. Most were business correspondence, dry and clipped, until she reached one dated 30 years earlier, addressed to her grandfather from a name she didn't recognize, Thomas Reyes. "You promised this would be made right," it read. "I put everything into this land, and you let them push me out like I was never here. If you won't do right by me, I'll make sure the truth outlives us both." Rae read it twice, heart hammering. A partner. Someone who had helped build this orchard and been erased from it, the way her own name had been erased from the family generations later. The pattern felt too familiar to be coincidence. She thought of the fruit splitting open in her hand, the metal fragment hidden inside like a promise someone had never kept. Suddenly the orchard's decades of quiet, stubborn losses didn't look like failure at all. They looked like guilt, growing roots, refusing to be forgotten. Earl agreed to come out to the orchard the next morning, though he made it clear he wasn't happy about it. "Last time I walked these rows for your family," he muttered, climbing out of his truck. "I ended up out of a job. Let's hope this ends better." Together they moved through the orchard with a notepad and a length of twine, marking every tree still heavy with fruit against the ones that had gone brittle and bare. At first it looked random, scattered survivors among the dying. But as Rae sketched the positions onto a rough map of the property, a shape began to emerge from the chaos. Lines. Straight, deliberate lines, cutting diagonally across the rows in a pattern that had nothing to do with sunlight or soil. "That's not nature," Earl said quietly, studying the paper. Somebody planted these on purpose, or protected them on purpose. Rae traced the lines with her finger. They converged, all of them, toward a single point near the old tool shed at the eastern edge of the property, ground that had never been part of any planting record she'd found in the ledger. "What's under there?" she asked. Earl's jaw tightened. "Back when I worked here, your grandfather wouldn't let anyone near that shed. Not for repairs. Not for storage. I always figured he just didn't trust the workers." He shook his head slowly. "Now I'm wondering if he didn't trust anybody." Rae stared at the shed, weathered and sagging, suddenly looking less like a forgotten outbuilding and more like a door someone had spent decades keeping shut. A vault, a strongbox, something worse. Whatever it was, the trees themselves seemed to be pointing toward it, fruiting stubbornly year after year, as if determined not to let the location be forgotten. Long after the man who'd planted them was gone, and long after everyone else had stopped looking, Rae felt the ground beneath her feet differently now. Not dead land, a map. Rae woke to the sound of an engine idling somewhere out past the trees, low and mechanical, wrong in a place that should have held nothing but crickets and wind. By the time she reached the window, headlights were already swinging back toward the road, taillights shrinking into the dark. She grabbed a flashlight and went out anyway, bare feet cold against the porch boards, heart hammering against the silence that followed. The damage was easy to find. Someone had driven straight through the eastern rows, the marked ones, the ones that formed the lines on her map, tires tearing deep grooves through soft earth, branches snapped and dragging where the vehicle had clipped them on its way past the shed. The fence nearby hung open on broken hinges, deliberately forced, and nailed to the shed door, pale in her flashlight beam, was a folded scrap of paper. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Sell it. Before you get hurt finding something that isn't yours. No signature. No need for one." Rae stood there a long moment, cold sinking through her chest that had nothing to do with the night air. This wasn't a warning about money anymore. It wasn't Meredith's honeyed phone calls or a bank's official letterhead. This was someone standing close enough to touch her fence in the dark, close enough to know exactly which rows to target. Someone was watching. Someone knew about the pattern in the trees, maybe even knew what waited beneath the shed better than she did. She thought of Thomas Reyes's letter, of promises broken 30 years ago, of a family that had buried its debts instead of paying them. Whatever was hidden here, it was worth more than land. It was worth threatening a stranger over. Rae folded the note carefully, jaw tight. She wasn't selling anything. Rae spread every page of the ledger across the kitchen table, alongside the letters, alongside a legal pad covered in her own frantic notes. She'd spent 3 nights chasing numbers that refused to make sense, until tonight, when they finally did. The second column in her grandfather's books wasn't hidden income from the orchard at all. It was a debt, a running tally, decade after decade, of money owed to a name that appeared again and again beside the figures. T. Reyes, 40%, 40%. Not an employee's wage, a partner's share. Rae dug back through the letters until she found the one that connected it, dated only months after Thomas Reyes's angry demand for what he was owed. This one was written in her grandfather's hand, unsent, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. "I cannot undo what my brothers did to you. The business is theirs now, built on money that should have been yours. But I will not let your share disappear. I am keeping it here in the one place they will never think to look, the land itself. When the time is right, it will find its way back to your family, or mine, whichever still remembers what's right." Rae's breath caught. My family, or his. She pulled the last document from the box, a faded birth certificate she hadn't looked at closely until now. Her mother's name, and beside father, a name that wasn't a Calloway at all, Thomas Reyes. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. She wasn't just an outsider the family had quietly frozen out. She was the daughter of the man they'd betrayed in the first place. The reason? Perhaps she'd never quite belonged. Among people who'd spent decades trying to bury what they owed her family twice over, the orchard hadn't been a punishment. It had been an apology no one else was ever supposed to be able to cash. And somewhere beneath that shed, her grandfather had made sure it still could be. The foreclosure notice gave her 3 days left. The storm building on the horizon gave her less than that. Earl arrived just after dawn with 2 shovels, a pickaxe, and a face that said he understood exactly what they were risking. Neither of them spoke much as they walked to the shed. The sky above already bruising purple at the edges. Wind moving restless through the crooked rows, like the orchard itself was holding its breath. They started digging where the lines on Rae's map converged, a few feet from the shed's foundation, in soil that had clearly been disturbed once, long ago, and left undisturbed since. The ground fought them. Roots crossed underground in thick, stubborn tangles, and more than once the shovel jarred hard against stone that turned out to be nothing but stone. Sweat mixed with the first fine mist of rain. Rae's shoulders burned, her palms blistered raw against the wooden handle. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Not with the clock behind her and the threat of headlights returning after dark. "There," Earl said suddenly, breathless, pointing at the tree line. "Someone's out on the road." Rae glanced up just long enough to see a car slow at the property line before continuing on, watching, waiting. She turned back to the hole and dug. Faster, thunder rolled somewhere distant, low and warning as the shovel struck something that didn't give. Not root, not stone. Metal. Rae dropped to her knees, clawing wet earth away with bare hands until the edge of it emerged. A corner, seamed and deliberate, buried with intention rather than accident. Earl knelt beside her, and together they worked the dirt loose, rain falling harder now, soaking through their clothes, until the shape of it was unmistakable. A strong box, rusted but sealed, heavy enough that it took both of them to work it free from the earth that had guarded it for 30 years. Rae sat back on her heels in the mud, chest heaving, rain running down her face, staring at the box her grandfather had buried and her father had died fighting for. Whatever truth it held, there was no more waiting to find out. They carried the strong box inside before the storm broke fully open, setting it on the kitchen table like something that might still bite. Rae's hands trembled as she worked the old lock with a screwdriver, rust flaking away in orange dust, until the hinge finally gave with a groan that sounded almost like relief. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, was everything her grandfather had promised and never lived to deliver. Deeds first, original partnership documents, signed in ink that had browned but never faded, naming Thomas Reyes as 40% owner of the Calloway family business, the very business that had funded the house on Magnolia Street, the investment accounts, the storefront downtown. Every dollar Meredith had ever inherited had a shadow debt attached to it, buried here, waiting. Beneath the deeds, a small velvet pouch. Rae untied it with clumsy fingers, and gold coins spilled softly across the table, not a fortune large enough to explain the desperation of a cousin's overpriced offer, but enough. Enough to clear the foreclosure, enough to save the land outright, and at the bottom, a final letter in her grandfather's hand, dated the year before he died. If you are reading this, then the family finally let it be forgotten enough for someone honest to find it again. This land was never truly ours. It was payment on a debt my brothers refused to honor. I could not fix what they did, but I could make sure it wasn't lost forever. Whoever finds this, Reyes blood or Calloway blood, the land, and everything buried beneath it is rightfully theirs. Rae sat back, tears mixing with rain still dripping from her hair, and let the truth settle fully for the first time. She wasn't the unwanted branch of a dying family tree. She was the rightful heir to something they'd spent 30 years trying to bury and forget. Proof that would clear her debts, and evidence that would unravel every fortune built on top of her father's stolen share. The orchard hadn't failed her. It had been waiting for her the entire time. Meredith agreed to meet at the lawyer's office, still expecting to close a deal on worthless land. She wasn't expecting the folder Rae slid across the table, or the way Hendricks's expression shifted as he read through it, page by page. "These are the original partnership deeds," Rae said, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse roared in her ears. 40% of the business our family built, signed by your grandfather, owed to my father, Thomas Reyes. Meredith's confident smile faltered. This doesn't mean anything." "Old paperwork, notarized," Hendricks said quietly, not looking up. "Filed with witnesses. Legally binding, then and now." Rae watched a decade of dismissal drain slowly from her cousin's face, replaced by something raw, fear maybe, or the first real shame Meredith had ever shown her. "You've spent your whole life living off money that was never fully yours," Rae said, and for once her voice didn't shake with the old hurt, only with the truth of it. "My father was erased so your family could look successful. I was erased right along with him because I was proof he ever existed." "Rae, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Rae said, and meant it. "But you know now." Hendricks cleared his throat, laying out the legal reality plainly. The estate would owe restitution. The fortune Meredith had inherited would be reassessed against the original partnership share, and the orchard's debts, backed now by recovered assets, would be cleared entirely under Rae's name. Meredith sat in silence for a long moment before finally looking up, something almost like respect breaking through the old condescension. "I always thought you got nothing," she said quietly. "Everyone did," Rae said. That was the point. She gathered the folder, stood, and walked out of that office no longer the family's forgotten mistake, no longer the name nobody bothered to say out loud. For the first time in 10 years, she'd been seen, and she'd been right. Spring came late that year, but when it came fully. Rae stood at the edge of the eastern rose, coffee warming her hands, watching sunlight spill gold over trees that no longer looked tired. The irrigation lines had been repaired months ago, fresh plastic gleaming where cracked pipe once lay. The fences stood straight. The farmhouse porch had new boards where the old ones had sagged, and the curtains. She'd changed those too, finally letting go of a version of this place frozen in someone else's memory. The debts were gone, cleared by a fortune buried for 30 years, and finally allowed to do what it was always meant to do. Meredith's family had settled quietly, the truth too well documented to fight. Earl had stayed on, no longer an old man let go without a handshake, but a partner this time, one who'd earned an actual share in what they were building. And the trees, the same trees that had dropped strange, impossible fruit into her open hands months ago, were blooming everywhere now, not just along the hidden lines that once marked a secret, but across every row Rae had fought to save. She walked the orchard slowly, the way she had that very first day, except nothing about the feeling matched. Then she'd felt like a stranger inheriting scraps. Now the land felt entirely hers, not because a will had said so, not because blood demanded it, but because she'd bled a little for it herself. She thought of her father, a man erased so thoroughly she'd never even known his name until a strongbox pulled him back into the light. She thought of her grandfather, guilty and quiet, planting trees that refused to let a debt be forgotten. Rae picked a peach from the nearest branch, turned it once in her palm, and smiled at how ordinary it looked now. No secrets left to split open, nothing hidden beneath the skin, just fruit, just hers. The orchard hadn't been her family's trash after all. It had been waiting all along to become her legacy.